Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Have you ever gotten that sinking feeling in your stomach? What's that all about? Is there a brain in our gut that communicates with the brain in our head? What do they talk about? A lot, as it turns out. Mood, for example, might often be more of a gut thing than a brain thing, which by extension means that deep down within us, microbes are playing a major role in how we feel. Joining me today to make sense of the state of the art in this area is Emeran Meyer. Emeran is the director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience at UCLA, and he's the author of The Mind-Gut Connection. It's a really interesting read into how our brains and guts are connected and how they influence each other. Emeran, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Well, this is a topic I've been very much looking forward to talking to you about. But before we get into that, I couldn't but help notice from reading your book that you've had quite a varied set of experiences in life, including, your family-owned sort of pastry and confectionery business, in Germany, and then your, travels to various parts of the world, including India, where you really established a connection with your gut, as you describe, the Amazon rainforests and all that kind of stuff. So you're a world traveler. So just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up and how you became interested in this fascinating topic.
Yeah, so, looking back is always easier than actually having struggled through these decisions. It seemed like it was an endless string of decisions, each of them seemingly insurmountable and not, couldn't be resolved with rational arguments or arguments from other people or advice that I thought. And so in a nutshell, yes, I grew up in a very beautiful area of southern Germany in the foothills of the Alps. Small town, was supposed to take over the family business of my parents, making delicious cookies and sweets and also coffee. So probably the unhealthiest food I can imagine. I didn't have any negative effects of it, even though I was exposed to this for at least 2 decades. And then came the agonizing decision. So I did really well in high school. Everybody said you have to go to medical school, which I really didn't want in the beginning. It was way down the list of my desired career goals, and everything else sort of popped up before. I mean, everything from social scientists, political science, philosophy, psychology. And then, at the end, it was kind of a gut-based decision. I was traveling with 2 of my high school buddies, which is a common thing in Germany after you graduate. So you do a long trip, typically to India. So we did not do it to India, but we circled the Mediterranean on this trip with an old Volkswagen bus. A wonderful experience through all these countries, and then coming back through Sicily. And I still remember there was a discussion, over the fire in the evening. What are we going to do when we get back? And at some point, it flashed up in my mind. Don't tell me where it came from. Yes, I'm going to go to medical school. I have the grades to get in, and so that's how that started. And the choice of medical school was always mainly influenced by my interest in psychology, I would say. So I was an avid reader of Jung and Freud, and So going to medical school was originally the goal, getting deeper into the psychiatry, into psychiatry. And that was kind of changed along the way because psychiatry at the time, the internships I did there was not, show me that this was not the kind of thing. I mean, prescribing pills to patients with mental disorders was not my goal in life. And then I did my thesis, a fairly ambitious 4-year thesis in the Department of Cardiovascular Physiology at the University of Munich, and was actually quite a challenge to find a thesis mentor who was interested in that. I said, I want to study how the brain influences the heart. So I found one person of many interviews I did. And so for 4 years, I studied this, how stress and emotions affect coronary blood flow and distribution of blood flow through the heart. It's very exciting. But then came another one of those moments. I was all set to go into cardiovascular surgery because I had to operate on, believe it or not, in retrospect, I feel bad about it, but at the time it was different. I must have operated on 100 dogs with open heart surgery and was really good in it. So I got an offer, to join the cardiovascular surgery department. I did not do that, even though it would have been more straightforward for my career. And then I did an externship at the Mass General Hospital in Boston and in gastroenterology, and then that convinced me. So gastroenterology is really the specialty that combines a lot of influences of the mind and the brain on the body and on the digestive system. And then I stayed with that. So it was kind of a relief after all these years of searching and experimenting and exploring. I don't think it was a waste of time. I learned a lot along the way. Yeah, so I'm glad, I followed this path. I'm glad I didn't become a cardiologist and or a cardiac surgeon. And so then, then it became kind of easy because once I knew exactly what the topic was, I finished medical school. I came to the US.
And when you say what the topic was, do you mean that you had sort of this intuitive sense that there was a connection between, the stomach and the brain, which is what you were
Yeah, I
interested in?
was, I was absolutely, and I mean, I haven't really gone back to this, but I was absolutely convinced there must be, from patient stories, almost every patient, if you ask the right question, would tell you the connection and how their emotions influence their gut function. There was a lot of talk about that suggested that these patients had a more sensory gut, a more sensitive gut. So that was a recurring theme as well. And then when I came to the US to did my specialty training and again a research fellowship at UCLA, that became the theme. And it was lucky. My mentor at the time, the late John Walsh, was a very open-minded and always searching for new ideas kind of a guy who especially wore these gut peptides, was called gut peptides or gastrointestinal hormones. These chemicals, they were synthesized by cells in the gut and then either had an effect locally in the gut or traveled to the brain and influence brain function. So when I saw that kind of research, it just convinced me, I'm on the right track. And the disease at the time that where this could be studied and you could get a grant for was irritable bowel syndrome. It was not, I mean, I didn't pick this because I love irritable bowel syndrome, and I don't have it either. But it just felt it's the most practical way to get funding, research funding in this area.
In your book, you mentioned that at the time, the prevalent view of the body was sort of a mechanical one, right? That it was this system of parts, and each had sort of a mechanical role. And you talk about how in contrast, you took sort of this informational approach to the problem, which seems like it would have been a difficult thing at the time. I mean, I got into AI actually, interestingly, also through healthcare in the late 70s and 80s. And this was by no means a sort of predominant view or even something that people were sympathetic towards. So what made you think you were on the right track despite the sort of, weight of the paradigm that's against you?
I mean, absolutely. What you just said, I fully agree with this. I mean, all this early part of my career was a struggle against the prevailing dogma. Mind-gut connections. Everybody laughed about it. Certainly, my specialty, nobody was interested. Funding was difficult. There was a very dominant way of thinking that these so-called functional disorders like IBS are gut disorders. I still remember meetings. I gave a talk, and then somebody got up and said, "Well, don't forget, Dr. Meyer, these are gut disorders. These are not brain disorders." And that lasted a long time. Even more extreme. I mean, systems biology thinking was completely absent. I mean, people, if you had done an interview with or a survey amongst physicians or gastroenterologists about what is systems biology, they're probably a very small minority would have known what's meant by that. It just artificial intelligence, similar in the 80s, was just not a term that in medicine played any significant role. The reason that I got interested in this is because and don't ask me why my brain functions like that. It's sort of, it always looks for connections between things. It's been very difficult for me to stick to one receptor subtype and say an alteration in that receptor subtype explains a complex disease with emotional and physical symptoms. And neither was it easy for me to see how the drug development, the pharmaceutical industry, and I worked for many years with companies that supported my research, but I could never really understand how blocking a receptor, one particular receptor in this complex universe of interconnected parts would be able to treat a disease like that. And that's sort of coming out. Really, there were a few exceptions. There was peptic ulcer disease at the time, and that gives you a good example. So peptic ulcer disease was treated by cutting the vagus nerve, believe it or not. So without us knowing what the vagus nerve did at the time, other than secreting acid, stimulating acid secretion, the prevalent treatment was to cut the entire vagus nerve. And obviously that had major impacts on all these connections that we now understand and begin to understand. But peptic ulcer disease then was one of those rare diseases where it was found if you eradicate a microorganism, H. pylori, then the risk of developing an ulcer became minuscule. And it's not that microbe H. pylori caused the ulcer. It was just a key factor for people that were stressed. If they didn't have that organism, they wouldn't develop an ulcer. But if they had this organism, then they would, So
it's quite striking that you mentioned this form of treatment. They'd cut the vagus nerve, and in your book you talk about the side effects this would have, and they would classify people as, I think you mentioned albatross syndrome, which is, okay, you develop a whole bunch of other complications, but that's someone else's problem. You've solved the ulcer problem. But let's back up a second here, because you mentioned the vagus nerve, and I think we need to define that along with some other terms. So why don't you sort of lay out your theory about this gut-brain axis and what's really going on there, right? So take your time and describe sort of the key elements involved and what the basic theory is, and why, and all the evidence that supports this theory. So there's a lot of questions in there, but unpack this for us.
Yeah, and probably I think in that explanation I should include the microbiome, because that definitely,
Exactly. Yes.
just a
Yes.
brief comment. About 10 years ago, we thought the brain gut model would explain most pathology and IBS, but then these spectacular findings from preclinical studies in animal models came, suggesting that the microbes can actually influence the brain, and the brain can influence the microbes. And so then, started to modify or expand our model, and that was actually very easy. So now the communication is, so there's multiple pieces of evidence that confirms this brain gut microbiome system, and I like to call it system because it's not a linear, either top down or bottom up. It's these circular loops of feedback loops, typically negative feedback loops. If something happens at the brain, it will have an effect on the gut, and that will have an effect on the microbes, and that in turn will feed back to the brain. So it is a system, and I think if you really want to understand and at some point manipulate it, I think we have to have that systems biological view. So if we start with the simplest thing, most people know, and there's body research going back a long time, to Pavlov, and so the Russians were actually quite advanced at Pavlov's time in these concepts about brain body, brain gut, cortical gut interactions. And so when we're stressed, we engage our central stress system in the brain that triggers the fight and flight response, orchestrates all the hormonal changes that are important, adapts body functions, shifts blood flow to the muscles so you can run and fight, and shifts blood flow away from the digestive tract, so because you don't really need it in that situation. Also tries to empty your gastrointestinal tract by triggering vomiting reflex and causing diarrhea. So the fight and flight response, all programmed in the brain over probably millions of years in evolution. Every animal has that, and so nobody can question that. But what we didn't know is that this this mechanism can also get engaged with not life-threatening stressors, but with emotions. So when you're angry, when you're fearful, when you're jealous, probably also when you're in love, even though that has not been studied, the brain sends the emotional centers or networks in the brain sends down signals to the gastrointestinal tract and modifies its function. So in the extreme, you can say if you go on a date and you're in love with that person, that meal that you eat will be processed differently than if you go into a business meeting and argue over some business decision that you don't like. It's hard to measure this, but there's enough studies on anger and fear, I think, that we can extrapolate that this happens with every emotion. And so the gut is almost like, can be considered the theater of the mind, or the emotions have a mirror image. Emotions have a mirror image in the gut, so not just in the brain. And with most emotions, we can see it in our facial expressions, because unconsciously, the brain sends signals to all the muscles and the facial muscles. But just like it does that, it sends down signals to the gut and changes transit rates and contractions and peristalsis and secretion and blood flow, a whole range of things.
The thing that struck me that you mentioned, and you've sort of alluded to it indirectly, I think, in what you were saying, is that there's a real brain in the gut, right? That this is a quasi-independent kind of a entity. It communicates with the central brain, but the traffic, you say, is 90% from the gut brain to the central brain and 10% the other way, right? Whether this is happening to the vagus nerve. So that was something that I picked up on, right? That's really interesting that there's actually this separate brain down there. When did this theory begin to get accepted? I remember reading in the New York Times in the mid 90s sometime, there was an article written by a journalist who'd really gotten into this that talked about the fact that there was evidence that the gut and the brain were connected, and that, these feeling, the butterfly you feel in your stomach, that's actually, something that's going on perhaps even independently of what's happening up there, and that these signals get, sent to the brain. So that was sort of an interesting theory. So when did people begin to take that seriously, that there's this sort of independent brain that we have in our gut? And as you mentioned, that has a huge number of cells and tremendous diversity.
Yeah, so it has 100 million cells, roughly. And it developed before our central nervous system, long before. Some of the most primitive animals already had that nervous system in the form of nerve nets that were wrapped around, a tubular structure. And that these early nerve nets could do both. They could trigger the fight and flight response, because when they contracted, this little tube, this animal would float away. But at the same time, when these nerves simulated contractions in a peristaltic way, they played a role in digestion. So at that early stage of evolution, all functions were combined in one nervous system. But then with the development of polar organisms, meaning organisms that had a head and a tail, there was this migration of neurons to the head, to forming the central nervous system, utilizing many of the same blueprints that were developed in the early brain, in this gut brain. So that explains why a majority of the neurotransmitters that we find in the brain are also present in this gut brain or enteric nervous system. And yeah, so I don't know exactly the year, but so Mike Gershon is sort of was a pioneer in this field, characterizing John Furness. A couple of Australians were sort of the founders of this entire entity, and did phenomenal work characterizing all the pathways in this enteric nervous system. And initially, most of these pioneers that did phenomenal work, they were not too much concerned about the central brain. So they were really all focused on sort of the GI functions of this enteric nervous system. And the way we can say it today is when there was a division of labor from the gut to the brain, all the functions that were necessary to be regulated in the gut stayed in the enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system, and Mike Gershon has always shown this on his experiments, you can take a piece of guinea pig intestine, and it will still have peristalsis and move a plastic pellet through it without any input from any brain. So the basic functions of the gut are all basically covered by this enteric nervous system, and you don't feel these. So the only way when conscious awareness comes in, you need the brain, and that's where you need the signals traveling up from the gut to the brain, and then reaching conscious awareness. Most of this information that travels up is not consciously perceived because we don't pay attention to it. If we did, it would be pretty disruptive to our everyday function if you constantly felt there's something going on. So most of it goes subconsciously, but it's nevertheless plays a role in. So, when you think about it, 90% of these fibers go from the gut to the brain of the vagus nerve. So there must be some very important information that the brain gets from the gut. Only 10% goes back down and regulates the enteric nervous system. That has long been a puzzle, why that is. And so today we know you bring in 100 trillion or 40 trillion gut microbes with all their signaling molecules and all the things that they produce, and they are perfectly linked with the receptors on these sensory ascending pathways. So that explains why this system is so complex. There's signals now from the gut going to the brain, and there are signals that the microbes produce, then first act on receptors in the gut, and then the gut sends them up to the brain. So now all of a sudden you have this complete communication system. All these participants understand and use the same language, the same peptides, same signaling molecules, which again is a proof that it started out all with this primitive nerve net in the Hydra organism, where those microbes lived for hundreds of thousands of years in synchrony, with these nerve nets, and exchanged genetic information. And
fascinating. I always thought of emotion as something that arises in the brain. And yet, as you point out, and you refer to the work, I think, of Jaak Penskap from Washington State, where he talks about sort of this, that we have this emotional operating system within us, right? That there are these emotions that get generated automatically and conveyed to the brain. I mean, I never ever thought that the gut would be a possible source of emotion.
Yeah, so just this concept of the embodied brain, that people often speculate, with artificial intelligence, could you create something like the human brain, but it would not have a body, it would. And so the question has always been, would that be really a complete and functioning brain, or is it essential to have that emotional component, or that physical component? And the gut is obviously the main. I mean, there are also fibers, from my early thesis work. We worked on the heart. I mean, there's obviously also connections with the heart, less well understood, and sort of deviating a little bit of this, but I find that also intriguing that some ancient, healing traditions, like Ayurvedic traditions, they have noticed that, that there are these chakras, these energy centers, both in the belly area, but also in the heart. And I had a recent discussion about this. So, when we talk about strength and power and love, we talk about the heart. And when we talk about a lot of the more negative emotions, fear, anger, anxiety, we talk about the belly chakra. And if that has a basis, I'm not sure how many people are studying this in the cardiovascular system, but there are intriguing findings. At some point, we wanted to pursue this, that after cardiac transplant, many people develop depression. And is that because there's normally some influence from the heart to these emotional centers in the brain that get cut when you have a cardiac transplant, and therefore people develop these side effects? Maybe the next phase of, so right now we're in a phase of general excitement, both the lay public and the scientists, about the gut feelings, and maybe at some point it will shift to the heart.
Yeah, but for now it looks like emotion is complicated and it seems to be distributed throughout our body, right? Not something one sort of normally thinks of when you think of emotion. The other thing, by the way, I picked up on, and at the risk of getting too philosophical, was that most of the cells in our body are actually not human cells, right? That we're actually inhabited by bacteria and viruses, which make up the vast majority of cells and genetic material in our body, and that maybe we're just sort of conveyors, and that what we like is maybe what they like and what they want, and then that they're sort of driving us towards certain kinds of behaviors, right? It makes you sort of view this sort of, how much are we at the center of evolution and in control of ourselves?
Yeah, that has been discussed. I mean, the numbers have been adjusted somewhat. So definitely in terms of the gene pool, the microbial genes, which means the capacity, what they can do and what they can produce, is maybe 100-fold higher than our human gene pool. We only have 20,000 genes, human genes, and we have millions of bacterial genes. Science hasn't even really delved deep into these other microorganisms, like the fungi and the viruses, which almost certainly belong to that same ecosystem and interact. So the viruses, many of them are phages. This means they kill bacteria. So they clearly play a big role in maintaining the overall ecosystem, that this microbial ecosystem inside of us. But science is definitely lagging behind on that part of on that part of the science.
You mentioned earlier that in order to manipulate something, we need to first understand it, and ultimately our objective is to maintain good health, to do something about the biome. But before we go there, in terms of understanding, what is it that, you've laid out what we know for sure, that there seems to be compelling evidence, in favor of, the fact that there's this enteric nervous system that's functioning, somewhat independently. It communicates with the central brain. Like there's evidence of the similar neurotransmitters in the gut and the brain. So there's a lot we've learned over the last 10 or 20 years. What are the big open questions in this arena that we just don't know the answers to?
Well, microbiome science, I think the enteric nervous system studies, I think, have probably reached pretty much the conclusion. All the neurons have been characterized. It's been characterized what neurotransmitters they have, how they function in animal models. So I would say, we know about 90% of the enteric nervous system and what it does. I mean, in science, there may always be something new. All of a sudden, say, why did we think about this? It's in terms of the microbiome science, it's a young science. It's only like some 10 plus years old. And I think despite dramatic and exponential progress in the understanding and in the technologies to study it, I think we're just still at the beginning, maybe understanding 10% of its complexity. And some of the key questions are, what is the causal? But let me step back one. So most of the studies that are impressive and have driven this field are preclinical studies in laboratory mice. And that has a lot of question marks that science, because there's hundreds of different mouse strains based on their genetics. As scientists, we pick one that shows us the results we want to see. Secondly, there's homogeneity. We study identical, animals. There's no variation in terms of what their lifestyle is, what their temperature, what their food is. We study identical animals and compare them. Another one is we do some pretty extreme things, like we study germ-free animals that grow up with ever having been exposed to a microbe. Something that never occurs in humans. So many experiments are based on these findings. But then you go to the human studies, and right now we're at a phase where initially it was correlational studies or epidemiological studies. So you compared one population with another population. One population was eating a vegetarian diet, another one was eating an omnivore diet. And then people found, they have different microbiomes. Then there was this premature conclusion in the lay press. Oh, so that means that the microbiome plays a causative role in this population where the microbiome is abnormal. So we still don't know that for the majority of human situations. It's almost like every disease you look at, you find a state of dysbiosis, an altered gut microbial composition. From psychiatry to neurology to, everywhere. It's almost like you can't look at a population without. Some of these studies are flawed. too small sample sizes. But I think in general seems to be a tremendous heterogeneity in terms of the microbiome based on these on these epidemiological studies. So now we're in a phase, people take fecal samples from human populations, for example, with depression or with anxiety or with Alzheimer's disease, and put these samples into these germ-free mice that don't have their own microbiome. And then what happens, then these mice develop behaviors that are being interpreted by scientists as like depression-like or Alzheimer's-like or autism spectrum-like behaviors. There's also a big question: are they really do they have any similarity with the complex human diseases, like like depression or autism spectrum disorders? But those experiments exist now. So going from a human disease stool sample into a mouse model, the mouse develops changes in their behavior, which are being interpreted. So this is closer to causality, but still not 100% proof. So there are no studies really to date where you could say, okay, and we can't do them for ethical reasons.
I was actually going to ask you, like, as weird as this sounds, the I guess transplanting fecal samples, has this been done in scale with humans?
No, this has not been done. This is the only place where it's been done is in a human condition called C. difficile colitis, where in some people after antibiotic use, they knock out their normal gut microbiome, and it turned out that a fecal microbial transplant from a healthy person is very effective in restoring a normal microbiome, and that it prevents the recurrences of this disorder. So that has been shown, that you can actually take a healthy microbiome from somebody, either a relative or somebody who's, meets all the criteria of being healthy, that you can transplant that health to another individual, but not specific diseases like, even obesity. It's not been possible. Like you would think, if you transplant the stool from an obese mouse into a germ-free mouse, that germ-free mouse will become obese. There's no question. That has not happened. And it's, ethically, I mean, it's always where ethics come in. I mean, would you be allowed to make somebody obese, just for scientific interest, and that person may be stuck with that obesity for the rest of their lives because now they have microbes inside of them? So this is definitely an obstacle. And to date, I don't think we can say we're ready for large-scale microbiome-based therapies of specific disorders. I just don't think there's only this one condition.
So why is that? And I want to, I guess, preface that with another question, which is that there seems to be, based on my reading of your book, tremendous variability in what constitutes a healthy biome, right? A healthy microbiome, right? It depends on where you grew up, the conditions, your initial diet and exposure to bacteria and viruses. So there seems to be tremendous diversity, right? Whereas I guess you could more easily point to a healthy heart or a healthy liver or a healthy kidney, whereas even though there's obviously variance in that too, but there seems to be a lot more variance in what we mean by a healthy microbiome. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, so like any other ecosystem, diversity and variability are measures of health of an ecosystem. It doesn't matter if this ecosystem is composed of animals in the Serengeti or the microbes inside of us. And that's sort of been really the main criteria that we can use today, that this high diversity of relative abundances of organisms and strains protects I mean, the more diverse it is, the more stable is that ecosystem. So if it's threatened by perturbations like an infection or severe stress, it will bounce back. It will always, it has a high degree of resilience. On the other hand, you could say, I mean, the microbes have this unique capability of adapting to many different environments and diets rapidly to optimize the interaction with that new environmental situation, whereas our genes cannot. I mean, our genes are much slower. Number-wise, 20,000 genes. I mean, there are mechanisms like gene expression that's driven by social factors or epigenetic factors, but in general, I mean, the microbes really are much faster and better at doing this. People have done experiments having people switch from a vegetarian to an omnivore meat-based diet, and within 48 hours, the microbiome switched to that new environmental condition. So the fact that we have so many different this variety worldwide is because we all live in totally different environments. We live from the North Pole to the equator, to totally different dietary habits, and the fact that this is possible and consistent with health of people living in all these different areas with very different microbiome compositions indicates that the search for this ultimate healthy microbiome is really futile. It's not. It does. Now we could say, if we look within the society, or like within the US, for example, or within Australia, and we compare that with the way it probably was 75 years ago, then we can say we can see very worrisome trends. A decrease in abundance, a decrease in diversity, a disappearance of many organisms that were there, a new appearance of potentially dangerous organisms. So I think we have to look at it in two different ways. The holy grail of finding this healthy microbiome in general for humans, that's probably looking in the wrong direction. But in our society, I think it's extremely useful to say what has happened here in the last 75 years. How does that compare to people who have not gone through this rapid industrialization, not just of industry, but also the medical industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, all these things that in the last 75 years have exploded and have modified the way we live.
I realize that there's this tremendous diversity in the microbiome, and yet you point out that, developing targeted therapies at, making changes in the gut, and to provide relief for disorders has sort of met with limited success. Right? Why is that? Like, why is it that the therapies have been of limited success?
Okay, so as I said earlier, a great success has been this fecal microbial transplant in.
But that's not common, right?
That's not common. So this is a good example how well it could function. People are still working on this concept of identifying the microbes that are essential in this fecal microbial transplant and create a consortium of artificially harvested microbes and grown microbes, so you don't have to go through the whole fecal microbial transplant. And there's also the hope that approach could ultimately then be targeted at specific diseases. But that's a lot more hope than, as long as we don't know if there is a causative role in many of these disorders that are now being evaluated, as long as we don't know that there's a causative role of the microbes, manipulating the microbes is not necessarily going to give you the results that you expect. These findings may be, in some of these cases, maybe epiphenomena. Like in depression, for example, we talked about this earlier. If somebody's depressed, the brain will send different signals to the gut change the microbial composition. So then changing the microbial composition will not cure the depression, because the depression caused these findings. So that's a possibility, and I'm always surprised the naivety and the willingness of venture capital to pour millions and maybe billions of dollars into approaches that I think right now they just don't make sense yet. It's I think it's too early for us to really say, okay, this is like this works like the medication for high blood pressure, or where we know 100% it does work and it does change the health outcome of that person.
So, Emeran, is our larger healthcare system broken? I mean, I had Eric Topol on the show. He was one of my earliest guests, and we talked about all of the problems with the medical profession that he actually lays out in his book called Deep Medicine, right? And he chalks up a lot of misdiagnoses, which are incredibly high. I mean, I forget. I think he said like something like 60% error rate. Something just staggering like that. He chalked it up to the fact that people have so little contact with healthcare providers. Doctors are in a hurry. They spend 30 seconds or a minute with a patient. In the old days, they would spend more time. They'd palpate. Now they don't even touch you. And so he points to those as being some of the problems with the healthcare system. But I think you're pointing to a separate set of reasons that have to do with sort of how we view the body, and whether we consider sort of a more holistic approach in our diagnosis, as opposed to treating this as sort of a system of sort of independent parts.
No, I think the two things are actually connected. I personally believe we're in the midst of a paradigm shift, not just in medicine, but in science for sure. When we move from this traditional linear reductionistic approach to understand the complexity of systems, that's why artificial intelligence all of a sudden, it has sort of, you can read this more and more often now in studies. Also, the systems biology approach. Also, what's been happening, the disillusionment of many patients with the traditional medical system, migrating off to functional medicine practitioners who have a much more holistic way of seeing the body and health and lifestyle factors. A lot of the young physicians feel the need to do that in their they're also frustrated with the with the traditional teaching. There's also the appearance of wellness centers now in even in academic medical centers. So UCLA started this big wellness program which does things and looks at things that would have been unimaginable when I started my fellowship. So we are in the midst of this change, and I think it will ultimately affect the way that we approach diseases and have greater success. And we shouldn't forget, I mean, medicine has been phenomenal, and some of the medications, have saved millions of lives. Talk about the antibiotics, talk about the antidepressants, antihypertensives. But these are generally for more acute problems who have not been good to understand the complexity of mechanisms that lead to hypertension or make somebody chronically depressed or somebody develop metabolic syndrome. I think we're beginning. You see more and more people that talk about multiple interacting factors. You just have to quantify this into a network. And then the simple theory, once you get down this direction, which is happening, the simple approach, 20 years ago, you could cut the vagus nerve. It's not going to happen anymore. And giving antibiotics for a lot of diseases or a lot of symptoms that don't require them won't happen anymore. The more we understand, I think, how all these things are connected in terms of the antibiotics, we give the antibiotics without thinking about the microbes. So now more and more physicians are trained be careful with the antibiotics unless they're really indicated, because you can do more damage than benefit. And I think that this is happening it's kind of happening slowly, because one factor that slows it is the commercial aspect. Modern medicine is extremely lucrative for its providers, for some even more than for others. And there's professional organizations that will try to prevent a change away from, give you one example, like screening colonoscopies. There was a recent paper out of Scandinavia, a huge study, 80,000 people. Make a long story short, showing that the benefit of screening colonoscopies on everybody is not as successful and impactful as the medical organizations in the US would have made you believe. It's effective in some people, but not these dramatic numbers. So this has already been attacked, this study, but you can imagine what impact this has financially on this industry of, gastroenterologists and colonoscopies, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's true about other areas as well. I think there was also a recent paper, it's interesting, it came out at the same time, about the evidence for the effectiveness of serotonin targeted drugs like SSRIs and NSRIs, and it's hard to believe. I mean, I have to go back to this meta-analysis. It was published in a high-impact journal, Molecular Psychiatry. It came to the conclusion that there's very little evidence, consistent evidence from well-controlled studies, that any of these approaches have really made a huge difference. It seems hard to believe, but I think we have to be careful. So when we make these assessments of the health of our medical system, we have to be careful to put in both it's lagging behind in terms of its understanding, the scientific understanding of the systems biology, but it's also, we have to be careful, pay attention to the influences that are being exerted by commercial entities, to push this into one direction.
Indeed, it is staggering. You point to the study of 11 industrialized nations where the US is the most expensive, in terms of the resources that we put into it, and comes in last in terms of effectiveness. And it just seems to be a combination of influences, the pharma industry, VCs, and just people just not being well informed enough. You're a gut person, and so obviously diet is sort of probably central to how you advise people. Do you find any differences in the goodness of the microbiome of vegetarians versus meat eaters?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, this is something we haven't talked about yet. We're not ready yet to have specific targeted microbiome therapies, but I think in terms of diet, we can say with fairly good evidence. I mean, most of it is epidemiological, cross-sectional, but there's now some, mechanistic studies as well. You can say that a diet with a high percentage of plant-based foods, does not have to be vegetarian, does not have to be vegan, has health benefits, and that's largely explained by the effect on the microbial ecosystem. So if you go back to this point, a healthy microbial ecosystem, good for our health. How do we create it? Well, we create it by feeding the microbes a large variety of things that only the microbes can break down, metabolize, and that's two categories of food items found in plants. One is dietary fiber, and the other one is polyphenols, these large molecular substances that were for a while promoted as antioxidants, but they work as antioxidants in the test tube, but not if you feed them, because I think that evidence is very strong, so, and I always give this advice is until cutting edge science will come up with these more specific interventions. So for example, that we can treat a disease like Alzheimer's or treat a disease like Parkinson's or autism spectrum, which diet by itself certainly cannot. Diet might prevent or slowing the development of these diseases, but it can't cure them. But until we have those specific drugs or interventions, I think sticking with promoting a healthy, largely plant-based diet is the best thing that we can do, because there's so many bits and pieces epidemiologically, microbiome science, that supports that concept, and it's in some ways very simple. You know, if you feed fiber to the microbes, they generate, amongst other things, short chain fatty acids, which are these ubiquitous anti-inflammatory substances. That's probably one of the main reasons for their beneficial effect in so many disorders that have something to do with chronic inflammation. So yeah, I would say diet will stay, in terms of prophylactic, very important. I think we have to move it into kindergarten and, early on, the parents' education. But there will be a time where science will come up with specific targeted therapies at these devastating, these end stage devastating diseases. So somebody may have dysregulation of their microbiome and their brain-gut interactions for 30 years before they develop these diseases. And if we can diagnose this at the very beginning, that risk, and if you can intervene with diet early on, I think it would be a huge improvement in our healthcare system.
So you point to sort of fat and sugar being the major culprits in messing up the biome. They cause, inflammation, irritation. What about these artificial sweeteners? Are we getting something for nothing there? Or are we paying the price there as well?
There's certainly not a optimal solution. There are studies, mainly coming out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel, some very elegant studies that indicate that artificial sweeteners are almost as bad, like for a type 2 diabetic, as sugar is. And part of that negative effect is mediated, or does require, the microbes. So the microbes are not inert towards the artificial sweeteners. And the end result is almost as bad as if you eat sugar. So if you have diabetes, certainly drinking cans of artificially sweetened drinks is not good for you. It will aggravate the situation.
Is that because, I don't know, are we changing the behavior of the bacteria in our gut by doing that? I'm just trying to understand, like, where's the downside? What goes wrong with these artificial sweeteners?
Yeah, it will change the behavior. It will change the metabolites that they produce. It will affect the gut barrier, which is made up by this mucus layer and the epithelial lining. So a lot of the things that happen with a bad diet also are mimicked by these artificial sweeteners.
So what about probiotics? You refer to studies in your book, talking about the beneficial effects of yogurt with probiotics. To what extent is this a fad? Because you see this everywhere, right? Everyone's talking about probiotics. And, I was talking to a biologist who said, well, it's useless because, they don't actually survive in your system. So even though they may be active and you ingest them, they actually, not, they don't survive, the conditions in your stomach. So what's going on in the whole probiotic industry? Is this a fad or is this real?
Well, so I would say there's a different ways of looking at this. So one is, probably the majority of probiotics today have undergone the testing that they survive the acidic environment of the stomach and occur in measurable quantities down in the intestine. So this was an early argument to dismiss the whole probiotic thing. The second thing is there's definitely the rigor that's required for demonstrating the effectiveness of a new drug is not applied to probiotics. The studies, most of the studies are weak and either too small, or the effects are very small. It's not placebo controlled. They're very expensive studies. If you want to do them like a pharmaceutical, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if you want to do that. I've seen that some big companies who have well-selling probiotics already, they don't want to take the risk of killing the golden goose. They don't want to do a $200 million clinical trial and just to show that there's no difference to placebo. On the other hand, there's lots of animal studies that suggest all kinds of beneficial effects on the health of the ecosystem, on the gut barrier, on inflammation. Very few of these have actually been translated into human results. So there's some companies that stand out. I've worked with one company for years now. We've done they've financed studies at UCLA, for example, the effect of probiotic intake on brain imaging findings, and they have spent a lot of money on evidence, on solid evidence based in academic institutions. There's a newer company that's doing the same thing, just finished a big study at Harvard on IBS patients. So this is kind of a change. So we're seeing very few players that have gone through this rigor of testing. I personally find, in my experience, so virtually every patient that comes to see me is already on some probiotic. And they ask me, what probiotic do you recommend? And I said, I can't really recommend any because, the definitive, if it works for you, if you feel you have a better gut health and you feel better, you should continue taking it. If you have doubts, then stop it for a while and reintroduce it and see if there is actually a benefit to it. But I do believe a big benefit is contributed by the placebo effect. If you do something every day that is healthy, does something good for your microbes, that's a very strong component of this. In addition to what direct effect it would have on your microbes, and there's even studies. There's studies that after you've taken antibiotics, a lot of people take probiotics after or during an antibiotic course. And there was a study also from the Weizmann Institute that showed it delayed the recurrence of your own healthy microbiome if you were taking a probiotic after antibiotics than if you didn't take it. So even in the opposite direction. How this is going to be settled ultimately, there's obviously a tremendous amount of chatter in the social media, and it seems it's no longer important what the science says. It's more important what the number of followers of an influencer are. That's what I always say to these companies that that want to do studies. That I think the horse is already out of the barn. People are going to buy what they read on the internet. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, Emeran, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to touch on decision making because you talk about that in your book as well. This sort of gut based decision making. And you refer to Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and he was a guest on this pod over a year ago. So what fascinated me was, is there like a biological basis for this thinking fast and slow? And I think you seem to suggest that there is. Right? So what is it? I find that this question really fascinating because I've always viewed this as a psychological kind of a phenomenon.
Well, it's certainly, I mean, I came up with this hypothesis, and as a scientist, I know hypotheses are there to be refuted and refined. So I won't say this is, this is the way it's going to turn out. But there's certainly this phenomenon of learning within the brain-gut microbiome system. So from early on, as infants, we experience distress. Early on, it's hunger, or that signal goes down to the gut, to the microbes. The microbes, as we know, then produce metabolites, and they go back to the brain. And we also know 90% of the signaling goes to the brain. So my idea was, are we generating over a lifetime this database of emotional moments, with both a gut feeling, sort of like video clips, very short ones, and then later, when we want to make a intuitive or gut-based decision, which so many people claim they do. I mean, like, if you pay attention to the media, it's almost every day at least 5 prominent people talk about they made this decision with their gut. So is it that somewhere in this brain gut microbiome system, probably in the brain, there is this database stored, and if you can access it, if you're a person that has learned from early on to trust that, then that will give you an instantaneous answer to your question. Whereas if you want to do it rationally, and we know all the circuits within the brain that play a role in rational decision making, it takes a while. It's a very slow system. It goes plus and minuses, and what is this? What do I project? Is this going to do? And if you go through this other system, which is like this Google or Netflix database that knows you extremely well, that it's almost like a mirror image of who you are, then you can access this instantaneously. I was sort of inspired to think about it this way. I was once at the Biennale in Venice, and there was an artwork where on the ceiling there was this gigantic screen with these tiny video screens of thousands of people that were talking. And so I was just inspired to think about, what if we have something like this inside of us, that we can access, and we get the answer that's best for us, custom tailored for us. The danger, and people have mentioned that, the danger with intuitive decision making is, what if you're a person that is very anxious, that had early life trauma and developed an anxiety disorder? Or is that system compromised, and are you going to make the wrong decisions because you're afraid of the things you should be doing?
That is fascinating, what you just said, because you also point to, you say that that there are cells in our body that seem to be these fast cells, right? So I guess what you're getting at is, was this system of fast cells kind of tuned properly to begin with? I guess, and that is sort of the larger question, right? That if it was, you make better gut decisions than if it wasn't.
And then the question is, we're living in a crazy time, obviously. Humans have never been exposed to the bombardment with information, and all the negative news that are circulating. And maybe that system is not that effective anymore in that kind of condition, but it was designed by evolution for an earlier time, where life was simpler. The hunter-gatherers, they knew exactly what was good and bad for the tribe, and so they could make these intuitive decisions without these risks that we have today. If somebody spends, I was recently reading this article in the New York Times that their kids spend 8 hours a day in the metaverse. I mean, you can imagine the programming of your inner database is completely different in an individual like this, as opposed to growing up in a regular family situation, and so I think what we're going through right now, we'll have to reassess all of our ideas about, because it's affecting everything from mental health to physical activity to, yeah, I mean, I think there's few dimensions of modern society that are not affected by this dramatic exponential change in information exposure.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Emeran, it's been fascinating chatting to you. I really enjoyed reading your book. Made me, I was very sympathetic to the thesis to begin with, but it made me see things in a new way. So, thanks for that. Any last minute advice you'd like to share with the listeners?
I would say, trust your gut, obviously. Take care of your microbes, which you can do primarily by feeding them what's best for them and having a mindful, balanced attitude without stress and anger and negative emotions. I think that's the best people can do from what we know today.
All right. Well, thanks for that. I mean, it's interesting to hear someone saying "trust your gut" because that has such a bad rap. The question as to when you should trust your gut is a fascinating question for me. Well, Emra, thanks so much for your time. Fascinating. Again, enjoyed talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.